The wind carried the scent of dust and rain as Jonas McCrae knelt in the dirt, one knee pressed into the earth, his hands steady in their work but trembling somewhere deep inside. He had not touched a woman in 30 years, not since the winter the world buried his wife in snow and silence. And yet here he was, pressing a strip of torn cloth against the bleeding leg of a stranger, her blood seeping warm through the fabric and into his palm. She leaned back against the barn wall, eyes closed, lashes resting on her cheeks, as though the weight of the day had driven her into some quiet place inside herself. Her long brown hair was tangled and wavy, the wind catching the ends and lifting them into the dim light. The lace at her neckline was freckled with dirt, the hem of her light purple dress heavy with mud. She looked half worn from the road, half defiant against the world. An hour earlier, Jonas had been alone by the fence line, mending a sagging post, when he heard it, a faint cry, brittle against the prairie wind. He almost ignored it. The land had a way of playing tricks on a man's ears. But it came again, this time sharper, and before he knew it, he was following the sound across the brittle grass. She had been limping along the roadside, one boot torn, blood darkening the fabric above her ankle. Her words were uneven, muttered. A wagon had run wild, the driver gone, maybe dead. She'd been thrown into the dirt and left to fend for herself. She told him she didn't need saving, her chin lifting as though pride alone could keep her upright, but her body leaned toward him all the same. He had brought her to the barn, away from the curious eyes of town. The walls smelled of old hay and rain-soaked timber, a smell Jonas trusted more than the stale whispers that clung to him in streets. Abel Harper, the storekeeper, had been calling him that strange McCrae for years, a man who spoke little, lived alone, and kept his memories tucked away like they were relics too precious to touch. In the shadowed quiet, he set her on a low stool and stoked a small fire in the corner. Water boiled in a tin pot, steam curling into the cold air. His hands moved with a caution born of habit, washing away the dirt from her wound, dabbing gently at the torn skin. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, the corner of her mouth softening despite herself. Her name, she said after a while, was Clara Bellamy. She was headed west to Abilene, looking for her brother who'd been driving cattle along the Chisholm Trail. She didn't say much more, but Jonas could hear in her voice that she'd been on the road longer than her body could endure. There was steel in her tone, but the kind that had been forged in fire, not born in it. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then harder, until the roof rattled and the scent of wet earth drifted inside. Jonas pulled his blanket from the cot in the corner and wrapped it around her shoulders, the wool swallowing her frame. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the storm, his silhouette long against the lamplight. He felt the shame creep in before he could stop it, a sharp pang that told him he was betraying something sacred by noticing the curve of her cheek, the way her fingers held the blanket close. 30 years of keeping his hands to himself, of believing his heart was too buried to dig up again. And now here was this girl, sitting in his barn, undoing him with nothing but her presence. She asked him if he lived alone. He nodded. "It's easier that way," he said, but the words didn't sit right. Easier, maybe, but not better. They shared a simple supper, bread, beans, and silence between the crackle of the fire. She ate slowly, as if each bite had a last, and he wondered how many nights she'd gone without. The storm outside began to quiet, replaced by the low creak of the barn in the wind. And then, without warning, the door banged open. Sheriff Eli Cotter stepped in, the brim of his hat dripping water, his eyes sharp and assessing. His gaze moved from Jonas to the woman sitting in his blanket. "Jonas," the sheriff said, voice low but certain, "there's trouble coming, and she might be the reason." Jonas looked at Clara. Her face had gone pale, her hands tightening in her lap. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. "I didn't know it yet, but the night I found her would be the last quiet night I'd ever have." Sheriff Cotter's words hung in the damp air, heavier than the rain-soaked clouds outside. Clara's eyes met Jonas's for a heartbeat, something unspoken passing between them. Fear, maybe shame, maybe a plea. She straightened her back, as if to face the accusation head-on. "There was a stagecoach hit an hour west," the sheriff went on. "Robbers took the strongbox, left folks hurt. One passenger's missing, a woman, wearing a dress the color of yours." "I wasn't part of it," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I ran from one of them. He would have killed me." Jonas studied her, searching for any crack in her voice, any sign that her words were anything but truth. He found only the same fire he'd seen when she first refused his help, a will to survive that didn't care much for how it looked to others. The sheriff's gaze lingered on Jonas. "Keep your eyes open. If she's telling the truth, trouble's still behind her." Then he tipped his hat and stepped back into the night. The next morning, the storm had left the streets of town muddy and rutted. Jonas saddled his mare and walked Clara into town for supplies. Heads turned as they passed. Abel Harper leaned in his store doorway, chewing on a toothpick, eyes following them like a man watching a story unfold. "McCrae's finally got himself a woman," Abel muttered to someone inside. The words rode the air like a burr stuck in cloth, impossible to shake off. Inside the store, Mrs. Cora Tate stood behind the counter, hands resting on the worn wood. She looked Clara over in a way that wasn't exactly unkind, but not welcoming either. When Jonas stepped up to pay for flour and coffee, Mrs. Tate's voice was low, meant only for him. "Menvey been shot for less, Jonas. Be careful who you take in." He didn't answer, just tipped his hat and led Clara out into the sunlit street. Later that afternoon, Jonas took her to a quiet bend in the creek on his land. The water ran clear over smooth stones, cold enough to bite. She sat on the bank, pulling off her boot, letting the current wash over her injured foot. He busied himself with the horses nearby, giving her the space she seemed to need. "You always live out here?" she asked after a while. "Since before most of these folks were born," he said, eyes on the leather reins in his hands. She hummed softly, a tune he didn't recognize, but it made the air between them feel warmer somehow. As the sun dipped low, Jonas noticed movement on the ridge. Two men on horseback, silhouettes against the reddening sky. They didn't ride on. They lingered, scanning the land. Jonas felt the old instincts rise, the ones that had kept him alive on the frontier. Inside, he told Clara quietly. "Now." She didn't argue. He stood on the porch as the riders came down the slope, stopping a few yards short. They asked if he'd seen a young woman traveling alone. Jonas let the silence stretch before saying, "Ain't seen anyone." His voice was even, but his body stood between them and the open door. They left without pushing it, but he knew they'd be back. That night the wind carried the scent of another storm. The barn felt smaller with the knowledge of what waited beyond its walls. Jonas sat at the small table, oil lamp flickering, while Clara lay on the cot, her eyes open in the dark. The sound came sudden, hoofbeats, then boots in the dirt. The door crashed inward. Two shadows spilled into the room. One grabbed Jonas by the shoulder. The other headed straight for Clara. Jonas moved with a strength that surprised even himself. He threw the first man against the wall, the impact rattling the loose boards. The second reached for Clara, but she'd already found the rifle leaning by the stall. The click of the hammer stopped him cold. Jonas didn't waste time. A fist, a grunt, and the man went down. Clara stood over him, the rifle steady in her hands, her chest rising fast but her eyes clear. The sheriff arrived minutes later, having heard the commotion on his way back from patrol. He hauled the man up and secured his hands with rope. "Guess she was telling the truth," he said quietly to Jonas. When they were alone again, Clara sat on the cot, the rifle still across her lap. "I should leave in the morning," she said. "You don't need this kind of trouble." Jonas looked at her for a long moment. "I haven't touched a woman since the year the earth turned red with war," he said slowly. "But tonight, I realized I don't want to let go." She blinked, a small breath leaving her as though the weight she carried had lightened just enough to bear. The night eased into dawn. The air smelled of wet grass and new light. Jonas stood in the barn doorway, Clara beside him, her hand warm in his. The prairie stretched out before them, gold under the waking sun. We think we're made to live without, until the day something fragile and fierce walks into our hands. And maybe the years we thought were empty were only waiting for the moment we'd find the courage to hold on again.